Welcome to the Festival of Dangerous Ideas podcast. In the lead up to the 10th Festival of Dangerous Ideas program announce, we will be releasing a collection of 10 speakers from across the 10 years of the festival, a decade of danger. Sign up at festivalofdangerousideas.com to hear what we have lined up for 2020. John Ronson is a popular festival speaker. So popular he has spoken at Fody twice. Being in the company of this Welsh journalist and author of popular books, including The Men Who Stare at Goats, is always a unique treat. Whether it's hunting for abnormal behaviour in the psychopath test, or examining the savage nature of social media's shame culture, Ronson's investigations draw you into the myriad of dangerous aspects in our modern society. Here we present a special double bill, with selections from his 2011 talk, Psychopaths Make the World Go Round, and his 2015 talk on shame culture. Please enjoy John Ronson at the Festival of Dangerous Ideas at his finest.
Hello. So there's 1,400 people in this room, which means statistically there's 14 psychopaths in the room. Or more if psychopaths like going to talks about psychopaths, and there could be like 40 psychopaths in the room. It's going to be carnage. Anyway, thank you for coming. I'll tell you a bit about how I came to write this book. I was at a friend's house, and she had on her shelf a copy of the DSM manual. Do people know the DSM? It's the Manual of Mental Disorders. And it used to be very slim. It used to be like a pamphlet in the 1950s, like 65 pages. And now it's 886 pages. It's a brick. And there's currently 374 mental disorders. So I was looking through it, wondering if I had any mental disorders. And it turns out I've got 12. I've got generalized anxiety disorder, which is given. I've got nightmare disorder, which is categorized if you have recurrent dreams of being pursued or declared a failure. And all my dreams involve someone chasing me down the street going, "You're a failure." I've got malingering. And I think it's probably quite rare to have malingering and generalized anxiety disorder, because malingering makes me feel very anxious. And I've got parent-child relational problems, which I blame my mother for. I've got caffeine-induced disorder, which I've got right now. Much later, by the way, I met the man who took the DSM from being that big to that big. He's a man called Robert Spitzer. He was very much against Freudian psychotherapy because it hadn't helped his mother. His mother was very miserable, and she went from Freudian psychoanalysis to the next one, and it never helped her, and she died unhappy. And so he wanted to come up with a new way. And so he decided to come up with a much more pragmatic checklist approach to mental disorders. So we invited all the people who felt the same way he did into a room at Columbia in the 1970s. And he basically said, "Has anyone got any ideas for new mental disorders?" People say, "I've got one, bulimia." And he goes, "What's his checklist?" They go, and they sort of type it out. And that's how bulimia came to be invented. That's how ADHD came to be invented. And I said to him, "Were there any mental disorders that you rejected?" And he proposed ones. And he said, "Yeah, there was one. Atypical child syndrome." He said the problem was when I asked the man proposing it what the shared characteristics were. He said, "Well, that's very hard to say because the children are very atypical." Anyway, so I was looking through the DSM and wondering, whether it meant that I was much crazier than I thought I was, or maybe it's not a good idea to diagnose yourself with mental disorders if you're not a trained professional, or maybe the psychiatry profession has a strange fetish to diagnose essentially normal behavior as a mental disorder. I thought, whichever's true, it's kind of interesting. So I thought I'd go on a little journey to find out. So the first thing I wanted to do was to meet a critic of psychiatry. So I ended up having lunch with the Scientologists, who have a crack team of psychiatry busters called the CCHR. They basically go around trying to destroy psychiatry wherever its evil lies. So I said to them, "Can you prove to me that your thesis is right and that psychiatry is just a wicked pseudoscience. And they said, yeah, we can prove it to you. And I said, how? So we can introduce you to Tony. I said, who's Tony? He said, well, Tony's in Broadmoor. Now, Broadmoor is Britain's most notorious, secure mental hospital. It used to be called the Broadmoor Asylum for the Criminally Insane. So I said, well, what did Tony do? And Brian, the Scientologist, said, hardly anything. He's completely sane. He beat someone up or something, and he decided to fake madness to get out of a prison sentence, and now he's stuck. He's stuck at Broadmoor. He faked it too well. No one will believe he's sane. Do you want us to get you into Broadmoor to meet Tony? So I said, yes, please. So we went to Broadmoor, me and Brian. I remember yawning a lot on the way there. And dogs do that too. Dogs yawn when anxious. I was just yawning and yawning. Anyway, we got there and we went to the wellness centre, which is where you get to meet the patients. And they all started drifting in one by one, and they were all quite overweight and wearing sweatpants, and they looked quite docile and slothful. And Brian, the Scientologist, whispered to me, they're medicated, which to Brian was like the ultimate evil. And I was thinking, well, that's probably a good idea. And then Brian said, there's Tony. And this guy walked in, and he wasn't overweight, and he wasn't wearing sweatpants. He was wearing a pinstripe suit, and he was walking towards me with his arm outstretched, looking like someone from The Apprentice. Clearly the outfit of somebody who wanted to convince me that he was incredibly sane. So he sat down, and I said, is it true that you faked your way in here? And he said, yeah, that's absolutely true. That's what happened. I'd beaten a guy up in Reading Town Centre, and I was on remand, and my cellmate said, you're looking at 5 to 7 years, fake madness. Just tell them you're mad. It's be easy. They'll put you in some cushy hospital. You'll have pizza. You'll have your own PlayStation. So that's what he did. He asked to see the prison psychiatrist, and he said, I said, well, how did you convince him that you were mad? He said, well, I'd just seen this movie called Crash, in which people get sexual pleasure from crashing cars into walls. So I told the prison psychiatrist that I get sexual pleasure from crashing cars into walls. And I said, what else? He said, oh, yeah, I told the prison psychiatrist that I wanted to watch women as they died because it would make me feel more normal. I said, where'd you get that from? He said, oh, a biography of Ted Bundy that they had in the prison library. Anyway, he evidently faked madness much too well, and they didn't send him to some cushy hospital. They sent him to Broadmoor. And I said, how long ago was this? He said, well, if I'd just done my time, I'd have done 5 years. I've been in Broadmoor for 12 years. I'm going to read a tiny bit from the book. It's an awful lot harder, Tony told me, to convince people you're sane than it is to convince them you're crazy. I thought the best way to seem normal, he said, would be to talk to people normally about normal things like football or what's on TV. I subscribe to New Scientist. I like reading about scientific breakthroughs. One time they had an article about how the US Army was training bumblebees to sniff out explosives. So I said to a nurse, did you know that the US Army is training... Later, when I read my medical notes, I saw they'd written, thinks bees can sniff out explosives. He said I was thinking it was probably a good idea that I didn't meet any psychiatrists when I was writing The Men Who Stare at Goats, which was full of this stuff. People don't know it was a book about... I met a guy who was part of a secret US Special Forces unit called Project Jedi. And I said, well, what was Project Jedi? He said it was a series of levels. He said level 1 was intuition. You're at a fork in the road. Do you go left, you go right? You go right. I said, what was level 2? He said, level 2 was observation. How many chairs are in the room? And I started to look around. He said, a super soldier would just know. And I said, what was level 3? He said, level 3 was invisibility. I said, that's quite a leap from... I said, what, actual invisibility? And he said, at first. But after a while, we adapted it to just trying to find a way of not being seen. I said, like camouflage? And he went, no. He said, level 4 was stopping the heart of a goat just by wanting it to stop. And I said, did you ever do it? And he said, yeah, we did do it once. But the man who did the staring, his heart got damaged at the same time. I said, was the goat psychically fighting back? He said, the goat didn't stand a chance. One time they had 30 goats in a room. I know this is a slight digression. They had 30 goats in a room, numbered 1 to 30, and they were staring at goat number 16, and goat number 17 fell over, which I guess is collateral damage. When you decided to wear pinstripe to meet me, I said, did you realise the look could go either way? Yes, said Tony, but I thought I'd take my chances. Plus, most of the patients here are disgusting slobs who don't wash or change their clothes for weeks on end, and I like to dress well. He told me that he didn't like hanging out with his neighbours. He had the Stockwell Strangler on one side of him and the Tiptoe Through the Tulips rapist on the other side of him. He said so he stays in his room a lot because he finds them quite scary. And they take that as a side of madness. They say that it makes him aloof and grandiose. So only in Broadmoor would not wanting to hang out with serial killers be considered a side of madness. Anyway, Tony seemed completely normal to me. What did I know? So I left, and I wrote to his clinician, Anthony Maiden, and I said, well, what's the story? And Anthony Maiden wrote back to me and said, yeah, we accept that Tony's story is true. We accept he faked madness because his delusions were very cliched, and the minute he got to Broadmoor and realised he'd made a massively bad decision, they just vanished. However, we've assessed him, and we've decided that what he is a psychopath. And in fact, faking madness is exactly the kind of cunning and manipulative act of a psychopath. So faking your brain going wrong is evidence that your brain has gone wrong. And I said, what else? He said, the pinstripe suit, classic psychopath. He said, that speaks to items 1 and 2 on the checklist. Grandiose sense of self-worth and glibness, superficial charm. So everything, not wanting to hang out with the Stockwell Strangler, that speaks to lack of empathy and also grandiosity. So everything that seemed most normal about Tony, his clinician was saying, was actually evidence that he was mad in a different way. He was a psychopath. And Anthony Maiden said, if you want to know more about psychopaths, you can go on a psychopath spotting course with Robert Hare, the man who invented the psychopath checklist. So I did. I went on the Hare psychopath spotting course, and I'm now a professionally trained and incredibly adept psychopath spotter. So what I decided to do with my superpower was, instead of putting it to philanthropic good, I thought I'd think about all the people in my past who'd crossed me and try and out them as psychopaths. So I did that for a while. People who were mean to me at school, and a critic called A.A. Gill was always very rude about my documentaries, which, by the way, is classic psychopath. But then I remembered I'd met a guy about 15 years ago, and I hadn't done anything with the interview at the time. It seemed too, just too odd. He was a guy called Toto Constant. He was the head of a Haitian death squad. And he'd got away with it because he was working for the CIA at the same time. So he fled to America, and the CIA, basically, they allowed him to live with his mother in Queens, but he wasn't allowed to go into Manhattan. He had to stay in Queens. So I went to interview him, and he met me wearing a pinstripe suit, just like Tony. And all he wanted to do during the interview was just profess his innocence. He just wanted to say, that everything anybody says about me is just a lie, it's all lies. And then he started crying, and I looked up and I realized that he was only pretending to cry. And I've never had a grown man in a pinstripe suit pretend to cry in front of me before. And it sort of creeped me out a bit at the time, and I didn't do anything with the interview. But now that I was a psychopath spotter, I realized that pretending to cry spoke to one of the items on the checklist, shallow affect, an inability to experience a range of emotions, and also cunning manipulative. So I thought I'd track him down. So I found him. He's in jail in upstate New York doing 12 to 37 years for mortgage fraud, which speaks to item 20 on the checklist, criminal versatility. So I wrote to him to ask him if I could come and see him, and he wrote back and said, yeah, any time. So I'm going to read another tiny bit from the book about what happened when I met Toto. Why didn't you come and see me last Tuesday, he asked me. That volcano erupted in Iceland and everything got put on hold, I said. Ah, he said, okay, I understand. When I got your letter, I was so excited. Really, I said. All the inmates were saying, the guy who wrote the Men Who Stare at Goats book is coming to visit you. Wow. Everyone's heard of that movie. Really, I said. Yeah, we have a movie night every Saturday night. Last Saturday was Avatar. That movie touched me. It touched me, John. The invasion of the small nation by the big nation. I found those blue people beautiful. I found a beauty in them. Are you an emotional man, I asked. I am emotional, he nodded. And by now I'm thinking it's taken me I flew 7 hours to New York and then drove 6 hours to upstate New York to see the guy. And I'm obviously wasting my time. He's emotional. Shit. Which I guess speaks slightly to item 7, callous lack of empathy. I am emotional, he nodded. Anyway, a couple of months ago, they chose the Men Who Stare at Goats movie. Most of the inmates didn't know what the hell was going on. They were saying, what's this? But I was saying, no, I've met the guy who wrote the book. You don't understand the guy's mind. And then you wrote to me and said you wanted to meet me again, and everyone was so jealous. That's nice, I said. When I heard you were coming last week, my hair was a real mess, but I wasn't scheduled to have my hair cut, so another inmate said, you take my slot. We switched slots at the barber shop. And someone else gave me a brand new green shirt to wear. Oh, God, I thought. Who's the unfeeling one? I only came here to hone my psychopath spotting skills, and this poor man wore a special shirt. Anyway, then Toto started saying that he just wanted people to like him. He said, I just want people to like me. That's all I care about. I want people to like me. It matters that people like me. And I thought, strange. I said to him, isn't that a bit of a weakness, not wanting people to like you? Isn't it a weakness? And he said, no, it's not a weakness. And I'll tell you why. If you can get people to like you, you can manipulate them to do whatever you want them to do. So anyway, when I drove out of the prison, I just felt like a genius. I'd cracked him open with my psychopath spotting skills. And I felt amazing. And then I started panicking. My amygdala went into overdrive and started shooting signals of fear and remorse and distress down to my central nervous system. And I thought, oh my God, what if, like he or one of his kind of family members comes after me and kills me when they read the book? And I started swerving all over the road, and I really panicked, and I pulled into a drive-in Starbucks, and I thought, okay, I'm safe from Toto because he's doing 12 to 37 years. But what about, like, say, one of his brothers? So I went through my notes, and I got to the part where he said, I'm all alone in the world. Everybody who's ever loved me has gone. I'm completely alone. All my friends have betrayed me. And I thought, oh, well, that's okay. Anyway, Robert Hare, the man who invented the psychopath checklist, said to me, forget about some guy at Broadmoor who may or may not have faked madness. Forget about some death squad leader. The big story is corporate psychopathy. That's the really important story. 1 in 100 regular people is a psychopath, but 4% of CEOs are psychopaths. You're 4 times more likely to have a psychopath in a position of power than you are to have one as your subordinate. And he said psychopathy is so powerful a brain disorder that it's remolded capitalism all wrong, because capitalism rewards psychopathy, and capitalism at its most ruthless is a manifestation of psychopathy, which I thought was a huge thought. He said you should try and get yourself in with a corporate psychopath. So I did. I started writing to him. I made some mistakes at first. I wrote to like the Enron people and Bernie Madoff saying, can I come and see you to find out if you're a psychopath? Anyway, they all either didn't write back or wrote back to say no. So I learned from that, and I wrote to Chainsaw Al Dunlap, who used to work here, right? Worked with Kerry Packer. Do people know Al Dunlap? Do people remember him from his days of monstrousness? He was America's most ruthless asset stripper. He'd go into factories and close them down just with a quip. He'd say, a famous story about him, someone said, I've just bought myself a new car. He said, you may have a new car, but I'll tell you what you don't have, a job. Worked over here for quite a long time with Kerry Packer and then did the same in America. Every time he closed down a factory and turned a town into a ghost town, the share price skyrocketed. So the areas of his behavior that spoke to the psychopath checklist were always rewarded with big payouts and huge hikes in the share price. So I wrote to him, not mentioning psychopathy in my email. I said, you may have a special brain condition, which is what makes you very special. And he said, come over. So I went to his mansion in Florida. This huge mansion that was filled with sculptures of predatory animals. It was like lions and tigers and falcons and eagles, like Narnia. Anyway, I said to him, we went into the kitchen. It was him and his wife and his bodyguard. And I said, I said in your email that you may have a special brain condition, like to do with the amygdala, that makes you very kind of interested in the predatory spirit and essentially just special. And he said, yeah, it's an amazing theory. It's like Star Trek. You're going where no man has gone before. And I said, well, might mean that you're a psychopath. He said, what? I said, a psychopath. And finally I said the words with enough clarity for him to hear. I said, I've got a checklist in my pocket. Can I go through it with you? And he looked a bit intrigued, and he said, yeah, sure. So I said, okay, grandiose sense of self-worth, which would have been hard for him to deny because he was standing underneath a giant oil painting of himself. He said, well, you got to believe in you. And I said, manipulative. He said, that's leadership. I said, shallow affect and inability to experience a range of emotions. He said, who wants to be weighed down with some nonsense emotion? You just need to keep moving forward. So he basically redefined many of the items on the psychopath checklist as like business positives. He kind of turned the checklist into like, who moved my cheese? I did notice, though, at one point during my day with him that from time to time he said something that wasn't at all psychopathic. So, for instance, he said no to early behaviour problems and juvenile delinquency. He said, look, I got accepted into West Point. They don't let juvenile delinquents into West Point. He said no to many short-term marital relationships. He has been married twice, and it's true that his first wife in her divorce papers cited the fact that he once threatened her with a knife and said he always wondered what human flesh tasted like. But his second wife he's been with for 41 years. So he said, no, that's not true. And whenever he said something to me that was reasonable, that was non-psychopathic, I thought, well, I won't put that in the book. And then it dawned on me, really, that being a master psychopath spotter had kind of turned me a little bit psychopathic. And I was just desperate to shove the poor guy right into the box marked psychopath. And I realized that that's what we do as journalists. We just desperately search around looking for the right sort of mad people to be entertaining. I didn't realize when I was starting to write a book about the madness industry that I was part of that industry. And I realized that we don't like defining people by their sanity. We like defining people by their madder edges. And maybe that's the wrong way to look at people. And maybe it's wrong to shove people into a madness box. And you know what? I'm not the only one. who's gone around the world drunk with power with their psychopath spotting abilities. It's used in parole hearings all the time, sentencing hearings. An expert will get up and say, well, I say this person scores 30 out of 40 on the psychopath checklist. And then they get an extra few years. Or sometimes they spend the rest of their lives in jail because they score high on the checklist, which is what happened to Tony. It took me a long time to try and work out with Tony. Is he a psychopath or is he a miscarriage of justice? And you know what? The answer is he's both. Although he always denied being a psychopath to me, Tony. He said one of the items on the checklist is lack of remorse, and another item is conning manipulative. So whenever I say I feel remorse for what I did, they say, just like the psychopath to feign remorse. He said, you can't win. Anyway, that's the end of this portion of the talk, and maybe I'll walk over there now and hopefully not trip.
Please, take a seat.
And just a quick language warning for this next talk with John Ronson.
Hello. Hi. Thank you for coming. That was the first time this week in Australia that someone introduced to me without acknowledging the elders past and present. And I would publicly shame you for that. But the worst thing about writing a book about public shaming is I'm not allowed to publicly shame anyone anymore. It's really annoying. Anyway, I'm going to refer to notes because for the slideshow because I've got a terrible memory. I've got a worse memory, and it's getting worse and worse. And in fact, my wife quite recently, as a special treat, booked me a surprise spa weekend, which is like the worst special treat for me because she knows I don't like being touched. Anyway, I was being massaged. And I was trying to make conversation. It was awkward. So the conversation got onto my terrible memory. And I said to the master, I've got a terrible memory. I don't remember anything about my childhood. It's all gone. And she said, as she was massaging me, she said, well, most people who don't remember anything about their childhoods, when they recover their lost memories, it turns out that they were sexually abused. So I said, well, I'd remember that. Anyway, I loved the early days of Twitter, and I still love Twitter to a large extent. I mean, this week what's been happening with the refugee crisis shows, just how incredible social media can be as a force for good. And in the early days of Twitter, it was just this kind of wonderful place of curiosity and empathy. It was like a place of radical de-shaming, like people would admit hitherto shameful secrets about themselves, and other people would say, oh my God, I'm exactly the same. And in fact, there was even a phrase back then, Facebook is where you lie to your friends, Twitter is where you tell the truth to strangers. And, it got, having funny and eloquent conversations with strangers got me through hard times that were happening in my actual house. And then we realized that when a powerful person transgressed, when somebody misused their privilege, we could get them. We could hit them with a weapon that we understood and they didn't, a social media shaming. So if a columnist for the Daily Mail wrote something racist or homophobic, we could get them. And it was a good feeling. It was like the democratization of justice. It was like hierarchies were being leveled out. But I think what happened then was that we fell in love with getting people who had misused their privilege so much that a day without a shaming felt like a day picking fingernails or treading water. It began to feel kind of weird and empty when there wasn't somebody who had misused their privilege that we could get. And into this odd atmosphere. Last night, actually, in Brisbane, somebody said, why did nobody notice what happened with Justin Sacco was so terrible? And I think maybe it's because, like, when you first marry somebody and you're so besotted, it's like you don't notice when they start acting fucking weird. Because into this atmosphere stumbled this unsuspecting woman called Justine Sacco. And Justine was a PR woman from New York City with 170 Twitter followers, and she'd tweet little acerbic jokes to them like this one. This was on a plane from New York to London, and she chuckled to herself, pressed send, and got no replies, and felt that sad feeling we all feel when the internet doesn't congratulate us for being funny. You start to think, well, what's the point? And you surround yourself with people who feel the same way you do, so when they don't congratulate you for being funny, it's like the whole thing crumbles. Anyway, then she got to Heathrow, and she had a little bit of time to spare before her final leg from Heathrow to Cape Town. So she thought up another funny little acerbic joke and tweeted it to her 170 followers. So she chuckled to herself and pressed send and got no replies, got on the plane, turned off her phone, fell asleep, woke up 11 hours later in Cape Town, turned on her phone, and straight away there was a text from somebody she hadn't spoken to since high school that said, "I am so sorry to see what's happening to you." And then another text from her best friend, Hannah, who said, "You need to phone me right away. You are the worldwide #1 trending topic on Twitter." So what had happened was that one of her 170 followers had tweeted the joke to a Gawker journalist called Sam Biddle, and he retweeted it to his 15,000 followers. Later on, I talked to Sam Biddle by email, and I asked him how it felt to have started the campaign against Justine, and he said it felt delicious. And then he said, "But I'm sure she's fine." But she wasn't fine, because while she slept, Twitter took control of her life and dismantled it. It came in waves. First there were the philanthropists. Then came the beyond horrified. Was anybody on Twitter that night? God, there's fucking 2,500 of you here, statistically. There must have been. I'm sure some of you were on Twitter that night, and I'm sure Justine's tweet overwhelmed your timeline the way it did mine. And I reacted the way that everybody else on Twitter that night reacted, which was, "Wow, somebody's fucked." And I sat up in bed and I propped the pillow behind my head and I was like... And then I thought, I'm not convinced that joke was intended to be racist. There is a comedic tradition of this, like Randy Newman or South Park. Maybe what she was actually doing in that joke was acknowledging her privilege and then mocking it by doing an exaggerated version of it. And in fact, when I met Justine a couple of weeks later, I'm still the only journalist she's ever spoken to, and she walked into the bar just crushed. She was still wearing the business wear of her former life, because later on that night she was going to have to go into her office to clean out her desk. And as she walked in, just so pale and wearing the business wear of her former life, it just reminded me of like Night of the Living Dead, like this spectral figure walking in. Anyway, so I asked her to explain the joke, and she said, "Living in America puts us in a bit of a bubble when it comes to what is going on in the third world. I was making fun of that bubble." But if anybody else realised, as I did that night, that was the presumed tenor of her joke, nobody said it. In fact, there's a writer called Helen Lewis, works for the New Statesman, reviewed my book, and said that she was on Twitter that night, and she wrote, "I'm not sure that joke was intended to be racist." And straight away she said she got a fury of tweets from people saying, "Well, you're just a privileged bitch too." And so to her shame, she wrote, she just shut up and watched as Justine's life got torn apart. It started to get darker. Then came the calls for her to be fired. Thousands of people around the world decided it was their duty to get her fired. Corporations got involved, hoping to sell their products on the back of Justine's destruction. A lot of people were making good money out of Justine's annihilation that night. Usually Justine's name was Googled 40 times a month, but that night and for the few days afterwards, her name was Googled 1,220,000 times, which means that Google made somewhere between $120,000 and $468,000 out of Justine's destruction, whereas those of us doing the actual shaming, we got nothing. We were like unpaid shaming interns for Google and Twitter. Then came the trolls. Somebody else wrote, somebody HIV positive should rape this bitch, and then we'll find out if her skin colour protects her from AIDS. And nobody went after that person. That person got a free pass. Everyone was so excited about destroying Justine that, and our shaming brains are so primitive that nobody could also handle destroying somebody who was inappropriately destroying Justine. And then Justine's employers got involved. And that's when the anger turned to excitement. What we had was like a delightful narrative arc. We knew something that Justine didn't. And in fact, Justine's inability to explain her joke became just a huge part of the hilarity. Somebody worked out exactly which flight she was on, so they linked to a flight tracker website. And then a hashtag started trending worldwide. Hashtag, has Justine landed yet? Justine was really uniting a lot of disparate groups that night, from philanthropists through to social justice people, through to trolls, through to these fuckers. And if you want to know what it looks like to have just discovered that you've been torn apart for a misinterpreted liberal joke, not by crazy trolls, but by delightful people like us. My book came out in February, and it's been a bit of a roller coaster since then. What I usually like when I bring out books is for everybody to tell me that I'm great, and then everything's fine, but that didn't happen this time around. And I've just finished writing a couple of pages that I think I'm going to put in the paperback of the book about what happened to the book after it came out. And so can I try this out on you? I've literally just finished it. I'll just read a couple of pages of this. Last Christmas, my US publisher sent me a box of Christmas cookies with a card that read, "Get some rest, 2015 is going to be a bumpy year." I emailed him to ask what he meant. He replied that some people were going to hate the book. Oh, nobody's going to hate it, I thought. How could they? I'm right. In February, the New York Times magazine published my story about Justine. Condemnation began hesitantly at first, a little uncertain, like a consensus waiting to form. The article did nothing but bring her back into the spotlight when we'd all moved on, someone tweeted. Poor thing. Her dad is a billionaire, someone replied. I'm not too worried about her. Justine's dad sells carpets. Twitter is the most flawed information swapping service. It's just constantly getting stuff wrong. And yet the mainstream media, already insecure about its place in this new world, like the nerdy kids sucking up to the bully, just allows Twitter to set the agenda and dutifully, gets in place. That tweet didn't ruin her life, someone added. Justine Sacco has a new job. Give me a break already. After a year, I thought when I read that one. She got a new job after a year. Nice people like us had effectively sentenced Justine to a year's punishment for the crime of some poor phraseology in a tweet, as if some clunky wording had been a clue to her secret inner evil. The fact that she'd managed to doggedly pull things back together after a year was now being used as evidence that the shaming had been no big deal from the start. I remembered a time I was on a beach in Scotland and a flock of terns singled me out. They circled above me for a while and then began to dive bomb, pecking at my head. I ran back to the road, shrieking and waving my arms in the air. You're probably too close to their eggs, my wife Elaine shouted after me. You should be aware of their nests. I have no idea where their nests are, I yelled back. My wife and I have a lot of fights. Quite recently, we went to a party, a dinner party, and as we turned up, the host said, would you like some crisps? And I said, no, thank you, I'm going to have cereal when I get home. And out the corner of my eye, I saw my wife was like mouthing something urgently at me, and I was like, what? And she went, be more general. This early tentative disapproval felt like the turns circling, and then the dive bombing began. After reading that excerpt from his book, I think it's safe to say Jon Ronson is a fucking racist. An opinion was beginning to form and feed off itself that I'd written an attack on social justice, a defense of white privilege. In coming out against online shaming, I was silencing marginalized voices because online shaming is the only recourse of the marginalized, whereas the world automatically allows people like Justine to succeed. But I just couldn't see how Justine's shaming made anything better, given that her joke was intended to mock racism. What happened to Justine struck me as just another terrible thing happening in the world. I wrote about Justine not because I identified with her, although I did, but because I identified with the people who tore her apart. I consider myself a social justice person. This was my people abusing our power. This wasn't social justice. It was a cathartic alternative to social justice. I decided to try and encourage those people to read the book, and so I tweeted, "By the way, the Justine Sacco story in the New York Times isn't a standalone article, it's an extract from a book." "Oh," someone wrote, "now Ronson's saying it's an extract from a book." What did that mean? It was always an extract from a book. Did you think I ran home and quickly wrote a book? But anything I said in that moment, I realised would just be more evidence for the prosecution, so I went back to being silent. "Why isn't Jon Ronson replying to any of us?" someone tweeted. "Because Jon Ronson only replies to men," someone replied. I liked it when people went for me in ridiculous ways, because when I recounted those comments to other people, they made me look good. I'm not sure whether I said that out loud or just thought it. I didn't regret writing Justine's story. I was basically being told it's fine to write about those wronged people, but don't write about that wronged person because it makes us look bad. A train crashed in Philadelphia. Passenger cars were ripped apart. 8 people died and 200 more were hospitalized. A survivor emerged from the wreckage and tweeted, "Thanks a lot for derailing my train. Can I please get my violin back from the second car of the train?" I think in the early days of Twitter, people would have been curious and empathetic. They would have said, "Oh my God, I'm so sorry that you've just been in a train crash. What was it like?" A journalist's favourite question, my favourite question is why? But that's not how Twitter responded. Twitter responded, "Some spoiled asshole is whining about her violin being on that Amtrak that derailed. People died on that train. And she's an idiot. I hope her violin is crushed. And I hope someone picks it up and smacks it against the train. And fuck that little bitch and her goddamn violin. I would slap the fucking taste out of her mouth if she was in reach." And then after she deleted her Twitter account, "Too bad she's a coward and deleted her account. How will her violin ever be returned? And I hope you get your violin back from under the bleeding people. Good luck. And your violin can be replaced. The dead are gone forever. And self-absorbed cunt. And I won't be cutting her any slack. What a sickening skank. I hope her life is exactly what a nasty bitch deserves. And 8 passengers dead, but she lives. No justice in the world." Like Justine, she was being shamed because she was perceived to have misused her privilege. And of course, the misuse of privilege is a much better thing to get people for than the things we used to get people for, like having children out of wedlock. But a great number of people who hadn't just been in a train crash were now accusing a woman who had just been in a train crash of being privileged. The phrase misuse of privilege was becoming a free pass to tear apart pretty much anybody we chose to. It was becoming a devalued term, and it was making us lose our capacity for empathy and for distinguishing between serious and unserious transgressions. I visited a TV studio in New York to film a video about the book. There was a doctor on before me filming her own video. "What's your book about?" she asked me. "Online shaming," I said. "Oh, did you read that piece in the New York Times?" she said. "I wrote it," I said. "Oh, you must be so happy," she said. "Actually, I'm not," I said. "Why not?" she said. "Because there's a backlash with people calling me a racist," I said. "So what do you want?" she said. There was a silence. "Xanax?" I said. She got out her pad and wrote me a prescription for 60 Xanax. I've got to say, when I got home and I told my son that story, he said, "You should have asked for oxycodone." It's kind of alarming, right? After that, I was no longer anxious, but I felt groggy. I had to weigh up whether to feel groggy or anxious. Later, I mentioned this to the comedian Joe Rogan. "Welcome to America," he said. "That's our dilemma, groggy or anxious." If I ended this now, it would all be great. It would be like a funny up to end it on. But I've written a couple more paragraphs, which I'm afraid doesn't do that. Can I just warn you? A 47-year-old Israeli government clerk called Ariel Runis was accused of racism. A black woman had been trying to renew her passport at his office in Tel Aviv. She later reported on her Facebook page that a female official had refused to allow her to use a special fast lane for people with babies. White people were being allowed to use the lane, but not her. So she complained to the office manager, Ariel Runis, who rudely brushed her off. Her Facebook post was shared 7,000 times. In response, Ariel Runis wrote his own Facebook post. "Up until 2 days ago, my life looked rosy, but each Facebook share is a sharpened arrow driven into my flesh. All my life's work has at once vanished with a thrust of a word, disappeared. For years I have worked to make a name for myself, a name now synonymous with the vilest of terms, racism. This will be my fate from now on." He posted his message, then he put a gun to his head. His body was found a few hours later. And then the next morning, the woman who made the original complaint wrote on her Facebook page, "This morning I awoke to some of the worst news I have ever heard. I am sorry with my entire soul for the loss of a life. For years I experienced discrimination in Israel. The only time I told my story, a man was hurt. No one is more sorry than I am. If I could, I would keep silent this time too." And then the journalist from an Israeli paper writing about the incident wrote, "The aftermath was disappointing. Instead of taking a sober moment to contemplate the seriousness of internet shaming, the powerful weapon was turned like a boomerang on the woman who had posted the complaints in the first place." Thank you.
These talks were recorded in the Sydney Opera House in 2011 and 2016 and were presented in collaboration with the Sydney Opera House and the Ethics Centre.